There is one decision a woman can make about herself that quietly changes how a man thinks about her, for good. It has nothing to do with becoming colder, harder to reach, or playing hard to get. It has nothing to do with tricks, timed replies, or pretending not to care when you actually do. It runs deeper than any of that, and it's stranger than any of that. Once you understand it, you'll understand why some women stay in a man's mind for years while others fade within weeks of meeting him. This isn't about manipulation. This is about psychology. The real, researched, sometimes uncomfortable truth about how human attention and human obsession actually work. Because obsession isn't built by chasing someone. It's built by a very specific kind of absence. Stay with this, because by the end, you're going to understand something about your own worth that most people never figure out. Something that changes not just how a man sees you, but how you see yourself. And the boundary at the center of all this is simpler than you'd expect, and harder to hold than you'd expect. Let's start. 2 women, 1 difference. Picture 2 women, both kind, both attractive, both emotionally intelligent, both able to hold a conversation and make a room feel warmer just by being in it. 6 months into knowing a man, one of them has quietly been erased from his mind, filed away as nice, a pleasant memory that never resurfaces. The other, 6 months later, is still on his mind, uninvited at strange hours, during meetings, in the middle of conversations that have nothing to do with her. What separates them? It isn't beauty, it isn't intelligence, it isn't effort. It's one internal boundary, held quietly and consistently, that the second woman has and the first doesn't. And here's the part I want you to sit with before I explain it. The boundary that creates lasting obsession is the exact opposite of what most relationship advice teaches. Most advice says give more, prove more, communicate more, reassure more. This boundary asks for almost none of that. But before I tell you what it is, you need to understand why the human brain works this way, because without that understanding, the boundary will feel impossible to hold on to. How attention actually works in the brain. Human beings are not wired to value what's freely given. Millions of years of evolution wired us to value what's uncertain, what requires effort, what might be lost. Behavioral psychologists call this the scarcity principle, and it's one of the most well-documented patterns in the field. It's why a sale ending in 3 hours feels more urgent than a sale that never ends. It's why the last item on a shelf gets picked up first. It's why a message that arrives slowly, thoughtfully, from someone with clear boundaries lands heavier than a message that shows up the instant someone thinks of you. This isn't cynicism. It's simply how the nervous system allocates attention. Certainty relaxes the brain. Uncertainty activates it. And obsession, at its core, is nothing more than a brain that hasn't been handed full certainty yet, quietly still working in the background to close that gap. When a woman gives everything immediately, her time, her attention, her forgiveness, her explanations, her presence, without ever protecting any of it, she unintentionally hands over the very uncertainty that would have kept his mind engaged. She becomes fully known, fully available, fully understood. And the brain quietly stops reaching for something it already holds in its hand, the boundary itself. Here's where the actual boundary comes in, and I want you to really absorb this, because it will change how you move through relationships for the rest of your life. The boundary that creates real lasting attraction is this: she protects her peace before she protects the relationship. That's it. That's the whole thing. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but it's the single most psychologically powerful decision a woman can make, because nearly everything else flows from it. Protecting her peace before protecting the relationship means she doesn't sacrifice her sleep to answer a message at midnight. It means she doesn't cancel plans with herself to accommodate someone else's last-minute inconsistency. It means she doesn't explain her worth to someone who's questioning it. Because explaining yourself even in calm, measured language, is still a form of begging. It means she doesn't shrink her needs just to avoid conflict, because conflict avoided today becomes resentment stored for later. This one boundary, peace before relationship, reshapes the entire emotional architecture of how a man experiences her. A woman who protects her peace can't be fully predicted, not because she's playing a game, but because she's operating from an internal compass instead of an external one. And unpredictability, when it comes from self-respect rather than manipulation, is one of the most magnetic qualities a human being can have. This is not the same as being cold. Let's slow down, because I know what you might be thinking. Isn't this just telling me to be distant, to be difficult, to make him chase me? No. And this is the part almost every piece of relationship advice online gets completely wrong. Coldness is not a boundary. Coldness is a strategy. And strategies eventually get exposed because they're performances, and performances are exhausting to maintain. A boundary is not something you do to someone. A boundary is something you hold for yourself, regardless of whether anyone is watching, regardless of whether it works. A woman with a real boundary isn't thinking, if I don't text back for 3 hours, he'll want me more. A woman with a real boundary is thinking, I don't respond to messages while I'm in the middle of something that matters to me, because my time isn't something I hand over the second someone else wants it. Do you see the difference? One is manipulation dressed up as self-respect. The other is self-respect that simply looks strategic from the outside. Men can feel that difference, even when they can't name it. They can feel when a woman's calm is performed for effect, and they can feel when it comes from somewhere real inside her. Only one of those is magnetic. Only one of those lasts. Obsession is built through relief, not excitement. Here's something almost nobody talks about, and it might be the single most important idea in this whole script. Obsession isn't built through excitement. It's built through relief. That sounds backwards, so let me explain. We live in a world full of noise, inconsistent people, people who say one thing and do another, people who love bomb you for 2 weeks and vanish for 2. Against that backdrop, a person who is emotionally consistent, who holds clear boundaries, who doesn't collapse under pressure or spiral into anxiety when things go quiet, becomes something rare, a psychological safe harbor. And safety, contrary to what dating culture likes to tell you, isn't boring. Safety is scarce. In a strange, counterintuitive way, safety is one of the most addictive things a human nervous system can experience, precisely because most of us have lived without much of it. When a man meets a woman who holds this boundary, who won't abandon her own peace just to keep him comfortable, something shifts in his mind that he might not even be able to explain to himself. He relaxes, and almost immediately after relaxing, something else happens. He starts to wonder if he can keep her. Because a woman who doesn't need him to complete her sense of safety is a woman whose presence feels like a gift rather than an obligation. And people, by nature, fear losing gifts far more than they fear losing obligations. What happens when this boundary is missing? Understanding the absence of something often makes the presence of it easier to grasp. A woman without this boundary often mistakes intensity for connection. She feels more in love the more anxious she becomes, because somewhere, sometimes as far back as childhood, her nervous system learned to associate anxiety with attachment. She checks her phone. She rereads messages, hunting for hidden meaning. She apologizes first, even when she wasn't the one in the wrong, because keeping the peace has quietly become more important to her than keeping her own boundaries. And here's the tragic irony. The more she does this, the less magnetic she becomes. Not because she's unworthy, but because she's unintentionally dissolved all the psychological tension that made her presence feel valuable in the first place. She's become, in a sense, fully solved. And study after study on human attention shows the same pattern. The brain doesn't obsess over things that are fully solved. It obsesses over things that remain slightly, respectfully, healthily out of reach, not because they're being withheld cruelly, but because they belong to someone with a full life, a rhythm, a self that doesn't revolve entirely around being chosen. What this looks like in an ordinary day. Theory is useless without application, so picture this. A woman has had a long day. Someone she's seeing sends her a message that's a little dismissive, the kind of small comment that used to send her spiraling into overthinking. The old version of her would have replied instantly, defensively, trying to smooth things over before the discomfort even had time to settle. The version of her who holds this boundary does something different. She notices the sting. She lets it exist without rushing to fix it. She finishes her dinner, her show, her conversation with a friend, and she replies later, not as punishment, but because her evening was never something she was willing to hand over to someone else's carelessness. That's the whole boundary, played out in one ordinary moment. No games, no scripts, no manipulation, just a woman who has decided her peace isn't a bargaining chip. And that decision, repeated across 1,000 small moments, is what eventually makes her unforgettable. The Zeigarnik effect. There's a concept in psychology called the Zeigarnik effect, and it explains almost perfectly why this boundary creates such long-lasting impact. The Zeigarnik effect is the finding that the human brain remembers unfinished experiences far more vividly than finished ones. Waiters famously remember unpaid orders better than paid ones. The moment the bill is settled, the memory fades. This pattern shows up almost everywhere in human cognition, relationships included. A woman who gives everything, explains everything, resolves every tension immediately, and closes every open loop becomes, cognitively speaking, a finished experience. There's nothing left for the mind to circle back to. But a woman who holds boundaries, who doesn't over-explain, who allows some things to remain slightly unresolved without ever being cruel or withholding, leaves open loops in the mind of the person experiencing her. And open loops are exactly what the brain keeps returning to at 2 a.m, in the shower, in the middle of a work meeting, when it should be thinking about something else entirely. This isn't about being difficult. It's about not over-explaining your worth to someone who should be paying close enough attention to see it for himself. Why this boundary is so hard to hold. Understanding an obstacle is half of overcoming it, so let's talk about why so many women struggle here. Most of us weren't raised to believe our peace mattered more than being liked. We were taught the opposite, to be agreeable, to smooth things over, to make ourselves smaller so others could feel more comfortable. We were taught that a good woman explains herself patiently, forgives quickly, and never makes anyone feel bad, even when they've made her feel small. So when it comes time to hold a real boundary, not a performative one, it can feel almost physically uncomfortable, like doing something wrong, even cruel. That discomfort isn't a sign the boundary is wrong. It's a sign the boundary is new. Anything the body hasn't practiced feels unnatural at first, even things that are deeply good for us. The woman who finally learns to protect her peace before the relationship will likely feel guilty the first few times she does it. That guilt isn't a warning sign. It's evidence of growth, how the boundary changes how she sees herself. Here's a layer most people miss entirely. This boundary doesn't just change how a man sees a woman. It changes how she sees herself, and that internal shift is actually the real engine behind everything external. When a woman begins protecting her peace, something happens inside her long before it shows up in the relationship. She starts trusting herself more. She notices the world doesn't end when she doesn't reply instantly. She notices that people who truly value her don't disappear the moment she has needs, and the ones who do disappear were never really staying for her in the first place. They were staying for her availability. This internal shift changes her posture, her voice, the way she walks into a room. And here's the piece that ties everything together. Men aren't actually falling for a boundary in the abstract. They're falling for the version of a woman who exists on the other side of holding it, calmer, steadier, less desperate for approval, more rooted in herself. The boundary is the doorway. Self-respect is the room on the other side of it. And self-respect, far more than any technique, is what real, lasting attraction is actually built on. A necessary clarification. I want to be direct about something because I don't want any of this misunderstood. This is not about withholding love to manipulate someone into wanting you more. Manipulation always collapses eventually because it's built on performance, and performance can't be sustained forever. What I'm describing is the opposite of manipulation. It's authenticity with a spine, warmth that has limits, generosity that doesn't come at the cost of self-abandonment. A woman who holds this boundary isn't less loving. She's often more loving because she isn't depleting herself into resentment. And resentment, not boundaries, is what actually kills relationships. Resentment gets built brick by brick, every time a woman crosses her own limits just to keep someone else comfortable. This boundary prevents that resentment from ever forming because it's set early, held consistently, and communicated not through arguments but through action. Consistency is the real test. It's one thing to hold a boundary once, in a single moment of clarity, maybe right after hearing something like this. It's another thing entirely to hold it on an ordinary Tuesday, 3 months into a relationship, when you're tired, when you miss him, when part of you just wants to collapse the distance and pour everything out at once. That's the real test. Lasting attraction isn't created by one dramatic act of self-respect. It's created by the slow, unglamorous accumulation of 1,000 small moments where a woman chose herself quietly, without announcement, without needing credit for it. This is why so few women hold this boundary long-term, not because they don't understand it, but because consistency requires something rarely discussed: patience with your own progress. You will slip sometimes, you'll send the message you shouldn't have sent, you'll explain yourself when you didn't need to. That doesn't undo the pattern. What matters is the overall direction, not a single moment of weakness, an uncomfortable truth. I think you deserve the full picture here, not just the flattering parts. This boundary doesn't work on everyone, and it isn't supposed to. Some men, particularly those only interested in ease, in low-effort attention, in relationships that ask nothing of them, will simply leave the moment a woman starts protecting her peace. And here's the truth that stings a little but ultimately sets you free. Those men were never going to become genuinely invested in you anyway. They were invested in your availability, which is a very different thing from being invested in you. Losing that kind of attention isn't a loss. It's a filter. The boundary doesn't manufacture interest out of nothing. It reveals which kind of attention was ever real to begin with. Some men fade the moment the boundary appears. The ones who don't, the ones who lean in, who grow more curious, more attentive, more invested, those are the ones capable of the kind of depth this is really about. The biology behind it. Let's look at the biology underneath all of this, because it makes the whole idea feel less like folklore and more like fact. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with desire and craving, isn't released most strongly at the moment of reward. It's released most strongly during anticipation, during the gap between wanting and having. Behavioral neuroscience has shown this again and again, most famously in studies on variable reinforcement, where unpredictable rewards create far stronger behavioral loops than predictable ones. It's the same mechanism behind gambling, behind the pull of social media notifications, behind the particular ache of waiting for a reply that hasn't come yet. A woman who holds boundaries, who doesn't offer total predictability, who remains partially, healthily outside of full certainty, is, without trying, activating this exact anticipatory system in someone paying attention to her. Not through games, through simply being a full person whose life doesn't orbit entirely around him. This isn't something you need to engineer. It happens automatically the moment you stop overgiving and start living fully, with or without his attention, bringing it back to something human. I don't want you to walk away from this thinking it's all just brain chemistry and psychological mechanics. At its core, this boundary is about believing you're worth waiting for, worth respecting, worth showing up consistently for, and refusing to accept less than that, even quietly, even when no one's watching, even when it would be easier to lower the bar just this once. That belief isn't something you fake into existence by memorizing a script. It's something you build moment by moment, choice by choice, every time you choose your peace over the temporary comfort of being chosen. And the strange, beautiful truth is this: the moment you start doing this consistently, not to attract anyone, but because you finally believe you deserve it, that's usually the exact moment real attraction, the kind that doesn't fade after a few weeks, tends to arrive. Not because you were trying to create it, but because you finally stopped auditioning for it. How this shows up in everyday communication. So much of this boundary lives in the small, ordinary exchanges of daily life. It shows up in not sending a 3-paragraph explanation when a 1-line answer would do. It shows up in not apologizing for having plans, for needing space, for wanting time to think before responding to something important. It shows up in saying, I need some time to process this, and actually taking that time instead of caving the moment silence starts to feel uncomfortable. It shows up in not fishing for reassurance through indirect hints, but stating clearly what you need, and then respecting yourself enough to notice whether that need is actually being met. Communication rooted in this boundary isn't cold or clipped. It's honest, direct, and unafraid of silence. And silence used this way isn't punishment, it's simply space. Space that a healthy connection needs in order to breathe. Space that an anxious, over-explained connection never gets the chance to have. Warmth has to come with it. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning, because without it, everything else risks sounding like a technique rather than a truth. This boundary only works, really works, in a way that builds something lasting rather than something fragile, when it's paired with genuine warmth. A boundary without warmth becomes a wall. And walls don't create lasting attraction, they create distance that eventually curdles into indifference. The goal isn't to become unreachable. The goal is to become a woman who is warm, present, generous with her affection, and yet completely unwilling to abandon herself in the process of giving that affection. Warmth says, I'm here, I care about you, I want to know you. The boundary says, and I won't disappear for myself to keep proving it. Both have to exist together. Warmth without boundary creates burnout and resentment. Boundary without warmth creates isolation and coldness. But warmth held together with a real boundary, that combination is rare enough and powerful enough that it tends to be the exact thing people remember long after everything else about a relationship has faded. One question to sit with. Understanding a boundary intellectually and actually living it are two very different things, and the gap between them is where most people get stuck. The next time you feel that familiar pull to over-explain yourself, to reply faster than feels natural, to shrink a need down so you don't seem like too much, pause. Ask yourself one question. Am I about to abandon my own peace to protect this relationship? If the answer is yes, that's the exact moment this boundary needs to be exercised. Not in some dramatic, rehearsed way, just quietly, honestly, in whatever small form fits the moment. That single pause, repeated over and over across months and years, is what eventually builds the kind of presence people can't stop thinking about. Not because you tried to be unforgettable, but because you finally stopped being willing to disappear for anyone, including, and especially, yourself. A closing thought. Have you ever held a boundary like this? Protected your peace even when it was uncomfortable? even when part of you wanted to give in, and noticed how it changed the way someone treated you afterward? Or, on the other side, have you ever looked back and realized how much of your peace you gave away trying to keep someone who never valued it in the first place? Either way, the answer is worth sitting with. Because the truth underneath all of this is simple: the peace you protect for yourself is never wasted, even when the relationship doesn't survive it. It's the foundation everything else, respect, attraction, real intimacy, is actually built on.